Okay, so thank you very much for joining this morning's Tech Talk, where we'll be looking at instructional design and some of the related project documentation. Now, just to recap, we previously looked at the ADDIE model and how we would go about operationalizing the ADDIE model. Now, this morning I'll be looking in a little bit more detail around some of the project documentation that I mentioned the last time. Now, when it comes to analysis, I'm not going to touch on that today, simply because we haven't got enough time. It'll take a number of sessions to look into analysis, and that's more related to project management as opposed to instructional and learning design. However, if you feel that'd be useful to you, please let me know, and I'll be happy to develop a few Tech Talks seminars with a focus on project management and analysis. So just to recap from the last time, so we begin with outline design, then we move through to storyboarding, content development, and then we have within this workflow 2 user testing and review processes, which really forms our quality assurance when working with each individual learning asset. And then we have final sign off, go live, and then some evaluation throughout the life cycle of the module or program. So to begin with, we start off with outline design. Now, the purpose of an outline design document is really to map out the module or the course. So we begin with our topics, and then we enter into conversation around how we would prefer to deliver each topic and the learning assets that we'd like to include for each topic. So the types of learning assets would be text and images, multimedia content, and quizzes and activities. Now, this is very much a collaborative process. So there's never a one-size-fits-all solution, and there's never a right or wrong when it comes to instruction design and outline design. So we're really looking to bring together the project team and thrash out some conversations with the subject matter experts available to really lend their expertise around the content where students would typically struggle. So where we may want to include a few more learning assets, and really just to share those experiences around delivering their content to students. And it is really a collaborative process. I think one of the challenges when you're working on a project like this is that you're bringing together people with different expertise. And what tends to happen is we tend to break off and work in silo. So each of us will focus on our specific area, and then we won't really tend to come together and collaborate. Now, first and foremost, it's a poor way of working because we're not sharing our knowledge and our expertise with one another. Secondly, it also adds to the life cycle of the project. So if you imagine a conveyor belt and everyone's taking their turn as the items move along the conveyor belt, that's going to cause delay. So when it comes to the outline design, I tend to introduce a design meeting, an initial design meeting, where we bring together everyone present. I would, again, look at the topics, we break down subtopics, best methods of delivery. And then we can also discuss timelines, which then feeds into the project management side of things. So we look at timelines for developing video content, any audio, etc. Now, I found that's a very effective way of working in the past. And everyone within the project team tends to appreciate that collaborative approach because then it allows us opportunity to learn from each other. And it also brings down some of the project timelines. So the example I have on screen is, so for topic 1, we've decided to go with a video podcast. Now, this can be just a short introductory video to the module or to the topic. I tend to recommend that a speaker or a module lead from the actual module or course delivers that, just to provide students with a familiar face from the outset. Now we've decided to introduce a drag and drop activity, usually based on the material covered within a podcast. For topic 2, we've decided to go with reading material. And again, this is very much dependent upon the topic that's being delivered. So what is most appropriate in delivering that topic? So it's never about selecting the kind of the whiz bang, the high-end tools, technologies, and methods of delivery. It's always about looking at what's most appropriate for the topic, for the material being delivered. And it may be that you want to include reading material throughout your module, in addition to any of the multimedia content, quizzes, and activities, just to appeal to different student learning needs and learning styles. So then we've decided to introduce a quiz for topic 2. And then we have topic 3, which is an interactive presentation and some activity. So examples of interactive presentations could be where students are reading through reading material. There may be a video podcast, and then you may have an interaction where there's some flashcards that we're asking students to read, and then select the flashcard and it flips over. there's a lot available within our toolkit or within our arsenal. And again, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more around the type of interactive presentations and activities that are available, please do get in touch. And then what we've decided to do here is go with a module quiz, which covers all of the topics within that module. Now, within the NHLI, we've used a lot of module quizzes. We found them to be quite effective. And the idea with a module quiz is that over time, you will build that quiz and you will add questions to it. So you get to the point where you've developed a huge question bank. So let's say around 100, 200 questions. And then the way you can release that to students is to have, you can release the questions instead of having them in an organized structure, it can be randomized. So each time a student takes the quiz, they'll receive a different random question. And you can also set a number limit. So instead of asking the students to do all 50 or all 100, you can set it to 10 questions, for example. And that's really to, again, engage students, but also to give them opportunities for formative feedback throughout the course while they're studying. Once we've developed the outline design document, that then feeds into a learning design plan or a tracker. Now, this tracker is used throughout the life cycle of the program. And the idea is to keep track of each of the individual learning assets that have been identified, to see where we are with them in terms of progress, and really to ensure completion and to ensure that we can find them later on. So for the purposes of this morning, I've listed program as the initial cell. Again, this is very much dependent upon the needs of your project team. So within the NHLI, we've developed individual program trackers. So you wouldn't necessarily need to name the program initially, but you may want to have one centralized report. And then that'll allow you to really break down everything that's available within a program. But it's really up to you and the needs of your project team. There we have the module and the topic, and of course, subtopics within that. And then from the outline design or the learning design meeting, we want to list each individual learning asset. And it's usually quite helpful to include the technology that's going to be used to develop that asset. And that really gives us an idea of timelines. You may want to have an indication of timeline within here as well. So what quite often happens is after the learning asset, you'll have a deadline date, for example, of when it's expected to be completed. And then we have the status of each individual learning asset in development. You may want to use some kind of color code. I think generally I tend to go for not yet started, in development, or completed, it may be useful to have a column for notes. If you're expecting delays, you can make some commentary around the nature of those delays and any support that's needed. And then the next useful item would be the file location. So this is related to each of the project files. So for example, if you have Word documents, PowerPoints, PDFs that are being used by way of content, you would want to store them in there. You would also want to have the individual files of the learning assets, of course. So everything within one location that the project team can easily access. And then finally, details of ownership, just to let you know the key stakeholders who are working on that specific asset, in case you need to get in touch with them outside of this design plan or tracker for an update. Then we go through to storyboarding. Now, the purpose of a storyboard is to create a mock-up of the final learning asset. So in theory, you should have a storyboard that is representative of each learning asset and each learning instance. However, there's not always the time to do this. So what you can see on the screen now is an example of a quiz slide where we have the questions, the answers, and of course, within the storyboard, you'd have indicators around which are the correct answers. You'd also have content relating to student feedback that you want to deliver. Now, again, depending upon time, you may not have the time to develop a complete storyboard, which has the final look and feel of the learning asset that you want to produce. But at this stage, you should really have conversations around color schemes, layout. Is there going to be enough space for the content that we're delivering? And also the content being included within a storyboard should be quality checked and signed off to say we're happy with this content in terms of spelling, grammar. If we want to bold or highlight certain key phrases, that should be done at this stage. So you really want to get as close to the final product as possible at this stage before we move forward into content development. Now, this example you can see on screen has been developed within Articulate Storyline. If we were to say develop this, take this information from the storyboard, develop it in Storyline, we could potentially end up with around 50 slides that look identical. To then reverse engineer that, if someone wasn't happy with the color color scheme being used, for example, it would take a lot of development time and that would cause a lot of delay to the project lifecycle. So it's really important to have those conversations initially through storyboarding so that we're absolutely happy with how we're moving forward. And again, just to reiterate, the storyboard should include all the content, all of the design information, and content should be proofread and signed off prior to going into development. Yeah, the next step is content development, where we also have our quality assurance, user testing. So what you can see on screen right now is an example of a review document. So we start off with our topic, the learning asset, and the location of the learning asset. So this may be a file which is shared within SharePoint, but most likely it's going to be a location within the virtual learning environment. So for us, that would be Blackboard Learn. Now, it's very important to conduct user testing within the live environment that your students will be accessing, just to make sure that the assets work as intended, and also to get a visual of the student user experience and the student journey. So then we can really, at that point, make any changes that we want to make. Then we have our first review comments. So there should be a dedicated reviewer. It's usually the subject matter expert who's closest to the content, just to go over each learning asset and to make sure that they're happy that it's been developed as was initially intended. Now, as I touched on previously, we shouldn't really picking up issues with content at this stage. So things like highlighting certain keywords and phrases, things like spelling, grammar, punctuation, etc. That should have really already been picked up during storyboarding. I can give you an example of where that didn't quite happen on a project that I was working on, where the document just hadn't been proofread at all. And then I ended up spending, I think it was throughout a week, we spent around 8 operational hours going through each piece of text within the virtual learning environment, where I had the subject matter expert speaking to me and I was manually making changes to content within the VLE. Now, as you can imagine, that was a huge waste of both our time, and it's time that we really didn't have. So I really encourage everyone within the conversations to absolutely make sure the content is what we need it to be before it goes through any development. Then we have the field related to any comments around the review. So this could be something as simple as change made, or it could be I'm unable to locate the review that you're referring to. Please provide some information. Then we have an opportunity for a second review and again, details around the amendments made around that review. You may want to have status columns alongside the first and the second review comments. Again, something along the lines of not yet started, in development, or completed. And then, of course, details of ownership, so we can just quickly pick up the phone and make a phone call to a reviewer for further clarification. Now, again, from experience, the the tricky part will be if someone's changed their mind around what they wanted initially, and then during the review stage, they come in with a lot of changes. Now, that has happened previously. And what you'll tend to find is if you imagine a project timeline go from top to bottom, we now start having a horizontal timeline where we're now spending a lot more development time within the first and second review than was initially intended. My advice in these circumstances is to really now bring that learning asset outside of this process and take it back as a new asset for development and really go back to storyboarding, so then you can thrash out any changes that are needed. And again, that will of course add to the timeline. But if we find ourselves in that situation where key personnel are adamant that they really want to make changes, then so be it, essentially. But it needs to be understood that will cause delay to the process and in getting those resources ready and available to students. But as long as those conversations are happening, that's absolutely perfectly fine. But it is really important just to manage expectations and be realistic around timeframes and what our capabilities are. Okay, so that's the end of this morning's presentation. I'd like to open up to any questions now, please.